A bear saves a baby from a swollen river. What it did after will warm your heart. The air hung heavy with moisture, and the dense forest seemed to hold its breath. Dark clouds rolled across the sky, a prelude to the storm that was about to break. Down by the swollen river, the sound of rushing water thundered through the valley, drowning out the occasional chirp of birds seeking shelter. It was a place of wild beauty, but on this particular day, it carried an edge of danger. Maggie, a young mother in her early 30s, clutched her toddler, Noah, to her chest. Her usually calm hazel eyes darted around in panic as she ran along the riverbank. Behind her, the trail they had been hiking had disappeared into a torrent of mud and debris after the sudden landslide. "Noah, stay with Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling. The rain began to fall in earnest, icy needles that soaked through her jacket in seconds. Every step was a struggle as the ground turned slick beneath her boots. She could hear the river roaring louder, the current growing more furious with every drop of rain, foreshadowing the conflict. The path she was following narrowed as it neared the water. Maggie glanced behind her, where the jagged cliff they had scrambled down loomed like a shadowy sentinel. Going back wasn't an option. The only way was forward, though it seemed increasingly impossible. Above the storm, a strange noise pierced the air, a sharp cry. Maggie froze. It wasn't the wind or the rain. It sounded like a child, but Noah was safe in her arms, and they were miles from the nearest trailhead. Her heart clenched. Was someone else stranded out here? "Hello?" she called, her voice swallowed by the storm. Suddenly, a deafening crack split the air. She whipped her head around just in time to see a massive tree give way to the wind. It crashed into the river, sending up a spray of water that drenched her and Noah. Maggie's footing slipped, and before she could steady herself, the wet ground gave way beneath her. The critical fall. Maggie screamed as she tumbled down the muddy slope, clutching Noah tightly. They slid toward the river, the roar of the water growing deafening. At the last moment, she managed to snag a root sticking out of the ground. Her arms burned as she dangled over the edge, her boots kicking at empty air. Below, the river churned violently, swallowing everything in its path. "Noah, hold on," she gasped, her arms shaking from the strain. Noah's tiny hand slipped out of hers. The world seemed to move in slow motion as she watched him fall. His small body hit the water with a splash, the current sweeping him away almost instantly. Maggie's scream tore through the storm, raw and primal. She clawed her way back up the slope, her mind blank with terror. A mother's desperation. Scrambling to her feet, Maggie chased after the river, her voice hoarse as she called Noah's name over and over. The rain blurred her vision, but she could just make out a flash of his blue jacket in the distance. He was still above water, but not for long. The riverbank became a treacherous maze of fallen branches and slick rocks. Maggie stumbled repeatedly, her knees bloody and her hands scraped raw. She didn't care. Nothing mattered except reaching her son. Then, as she rounded a bend, her breath caught. In the middle of the river, clinging to a partially submerged log, was Noah. His small arms flailed, and his cries were barely audible over the roaring water. Maggie's heart leapt, but it sank just as quickly. The current was too strong for her to wade in without being swept away herself. Foreshadowing the Savior. Through the rain, Maggie thought she saw movement on the opposite bank. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination, but then it moved again, a hulking shape, dark and massive, partially obscured by the trees. Her breath hitched. "A bear," she whispered, frozen in place. The animal stepped closer to the river, its heavy paws sinking into the muddy ground. It was a grizzly, its fur wet and glistening, its black eyes fixed on the struggling child. For a moment, Maggie couldn't breathe. Was it stalking Noah? The very thought made her stomach turn. But then something unexpected happened. The bear stepped into the river. Not charging, not lunging, but carefully, deliberately. Maggie's pulse raced as she watched the enormous animal wade into the torrent. The water surged around its powerful frame, but it didn't falter. It moved with purpose, heading straight for Noah. "Please," Maggie whispered, her voice breaking. "Please save him." Cliffhanger ending for the introduction. The bear reached the log where Noah clung desperately. It rose onto its hind legs, towering over the child. Maggie's heart stopped. Then, with a swift, almost gentle motion, the bear lowered itself, its massive jaws carefully gripping the back of Noah's jacket. The scene burned itself into Maggie's mind, the sight of the giant grizzly carrying her son to safety. The rain fell harder, the river roared louder, and Maggie stood frozen on the bank, her emotions a whirlwind of hope, fear, and disbelief. The critical incident. The storm raged on, relentless and unforgiving. Maggie stood on the riverbank, her breath hitching as she watched the bear carefully pull Noah onto the safety of a shallow embankment. Relief flooded her veins for a fleeting moment, but it was quickly replaced by paralyzing fear. Noah was out of the water, but he was now inches from a massive grizzly bear. The enormous creature loomed over her son, its wet fur gleaming under the flashes of lightning. Maggie's mind raced with every horrifying possibility. The desperate struggle. "Noah!" Maggie screamed, her voice raw from the effort. Noah whimpered, his tiny hands clinging to the mud as he tried to crawl away from the bear. The animal, however, did not move to attack. Instead, it seemed to study the child, tilting its head slightly as if trying to understand. Maggie's feet slipped on the muddy ground as she rushed forward, her instincts as a mother overpowering every ounce of fear. But the river blocked her path. The churning water was far too dangerous to cross, and the current threatened to sweep her away if she dared to try. "Stay still, Noah," she shouted, though she wasn't sure if her son could hear her over the storm. The bear lowered its head, sniffing at Noah. Maggie's heart thundered in her chest. She grabbed a rock from the ground, ready to throw it if the bear made even the slightest aggressive move. But then, something extraordinary happened. The bear reached out with one massive paw as if to nudge the boy. Noah turned his tear-streaked face toward the creature, his small body trembling. Instead of roaring or swiping, the bear made a low, rumbling sound, a noise that wasn't threatening, but strangely soothing. A mother's helplessness. Maggie could only watch, powerless and torn. She wanted to believe the bear wasn't going to hurt Noah, but every instinct screamed at her to act. Her hands trembled as she tried to find a way across the river. The seconds felt like hours as she frantically scanned the area for anything that could help her reach her son. Her eyes landed on a fallen tree trunk spanning a narrower section of the river. It was slick with rain and looked dangerously unstable, but it was her only option. "I'm coming, baby," she called, gripping the trunk and testing her weight on it. The log creaked ominously and Maggie's stomach churned with fear. She took one cautious step, then another, her arms stretched out for balance. Below her, the river surged, eager to claim her if she slipped. Halfway across, a deafening crack split the air. The log shifted under her weight, and Maggie gasped, dropping to her knees to keep from falling. Her fingers dug into the wet bark as the log teetered precariously. "Please, no," she whispered, her eyes squeezing shut. Another crack. This time, the log gave way entirely. Maggie's scream was swallowed by the storm as she plunged into the icy water, a fight against nature. The river seized her instantly, its frigid embrace stealing the air from her lungs. She fought to keep her head above water, but the current was merciless. Every time she managed to surface, another wave crashed over her, forcing her back under. Her mind raced with only one thought. "I can't die, I can't leave Noah." Somehow she managed to grab hold of a jagged rock jutting out from the river. It tore at her palms, but she clung to it desperately, coughing and gasping for air. She could see the bear and Noah on the embankment, but they seemed so far away now. "Help!" she cried, though she knew no one would hear her. But someone or something did. The bear's unexpected move. The bear's head snapped up, its dark eyes locking onto Maggie as she struggled in the water. For a moment, it didn't move, and Maggie thought she had imagined it looking at her. Then, with surprising speed, the bear turned and plunged back into the river. Maggie watched in stunned disbelief as the massive creature waded into the raging current. Its powerful legs cut through the water, and its thick fur seemed to shield it from the cold and the force of the river. The bear reached her within moments. Maggie's instincts screamed at her to back away, but she had nowhere to go. She braced herself for what she thought was her end. Instead, the bear leaned down, its massive jaws clamping onto the back of her jacket, not to harm her, but to pull her free. The unthinkable rescue. Maggie felt herself being lifted, her body weightless in the bear's grip. The current still fought to drag her under, but the bear's strength was unmatched. It carried her back to the same embankment where Noah sat, wide-eyed and trembling. The bear released her gently onto the ground, then stepped back, shaking the water from its fur. Maggie coughed and sputtered, her entire body trembling from the cold and the shock. "Noah," she gasped, crawling toward her son. She pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly as tears streamed down her face. "It's okay, baby. Mommy's here. We're safe now," she whispered, though her eyes kept darting to the bear. The animal stood a few feet away, its massive frame heaving with each breath. Rain dripped from its fur, and its dark eyes held an intelligence that Maggie couldn't quite comprehend. It didn't seem angry or aggressive. In fact, it almost seemed calm. The connection is established. For several long moments, the three of them, woman, child, and bear, remained frozen in place. The storm continued to rage around them, but within this small clearing, there was an almost surreal sense of peace. Maggie didn't dare move, afraid of startling the bear. But Noah, perhaps too young to understand the danger, reached out toward the creature with his tiny hand. "No," Maggie hissed, pulling him back, but the bear didn't react aggressively. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, almost as if bowing. It made that same low, rumbling sound as before, a noise that seemed oddly comforting. Maggie's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what to think or feel. All she knew was that this bear, this wild, untamed creature, had just saved both her and her son from certain death. A glimmer of safety or the start of something more. The bear turned its head toward the forest, its ears twitching as if listening for something. Then, with one last glance at Maggie and Noah, it began to walk away. Maggie watched it go, her emotions a tangled mess of fear, gratitude, and disbelief. She wanted to run, to take Noah and flee as far as possible, but something stopped her. As the bear disappeared into the trees, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter wasn't over. The rain began to subside, leaving behind a damp stillness that hung over the forest. Maggie sat on the embankment, clutching Noah to her chest. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body trembling with exhaustion and disbelief. She could still feel the bear's warm breath on her skin, the incredible strength it had used to pull her from the river. Noah sniffled, his small fingers clutching her jacket. His blue eyes were wide with confusion, but he was safe, alive. Maggie's hands shook as she brushed the wet hair from his forehead. "It's okay, baby. We're going to be okay," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. Her gaze darted toward the tree line where the massive grizzly bear had disappeared moments earlier. Her heart still thundered in her chest. How could she trust a creature that could have easily ended their lives with a single swipe? Yet it hadn't. The bear had saved them. The forest stirs. The storm's aftermath was eerily quiet, broken only by the faint sound of dripping water and the occasional rustle of leaves. Maggie knew they couldn't stay there. The embankment was too exposed, and with nightfall approaching, the temperature would drop dangerously. But her body was weak and Noah was too small to walk far. Her mind raced as she weighed her options. Could she carry him? Would they find shelter before dark? And what about the bear? The thought of it lingering nearby sent a shiver down her spine. Yet, deep inside, another feeling stirred, an odd sense of gratitude. A second encounter. Maggie was jolted from her thoughts by a soft rustling sound. She froze, her arms tightening protectively around Noah. Her eyes scanned the trees, and her stomach dropped when she saw the familiar silhouette emerge from the shadows. The bear had returned. Its sheer size was overwhelming, its massive frame moving with an unsettling grace. Water still clung to its fur, and its dark eyes gleamed in the fading light. Maggie's pulse quickened as it stepped closer, its heavy paws sinking into the wet earth. "Noah, stay still," she whispered, her voice barely audible. To her astonishment, the bear didn't approach aggressively. It stopped a few feet away, lowering its massive head to sniff the air. Maggie's breath hitched as its eyes locked onto hers. There was something in its gaze, something she couldn't quite name, a fragile trust. Maggie held her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to run. She knew it would be useless. Instead, she forced herself to stay calm, to breathe steadily. The bear took another step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Noah whimpered, burying his face in Maggie's shoulder. "It's okay," she murmured. Though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring her son or herself, the bear stopped, lowering itself onto its haunches. It was so close now that Maggie could see the steam rising from its breath. She noticed the scars on its thick hide, evidence of battles fought and survived. This was no ordinary animal. Time seemed to stand still as the three of them remained locked in a silent standoff. Then, to Maggie's utter disbelief, the bear did something she never expected. It lay down. An unspoken gesture. The bear's massive body sank to the ground, its head resting on its paws. It let out a low, rumbling exhale, a sound that resonated deep in Maggie's chest. The tension in the air seemed to dissipate, replaced by an inexplicable sense of calm. Maggie's breath came in short gasps as she tried to process what she was seeing. The bear wasn't threatening them, it was watching over them. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why are you helping us?" Of course, there was no answer. But in that moment, something shifted inside Maggie. She didn't know if it was exhaustion, desperation, or some primal instinct, but she began to trust the bear. Just a little. A test of faith. The forest grew darker as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. Maggie knew she couldn't stay where they were. They needed shelter, food, and warmth, and the bear, oddly enough, seemed to understand. The animal rose to its feet, shaking its fur before turning back toward the trees. It paused, looking over its shoulder at Maggie and Noah. "Is it waiting for us?" she thought aloud. Noah peeked over her shoulder, his small voice breaking the silence. "Mama, the bear wants us to follow." Maggie hesitated. The very idea of trusting a wild animal went against everything she knew, yet the bear had already saved them twice. And what other choice did she have? She took a shaky breath, her legs barely supporting her weight as she stood. "All right," she murmured. "Let's see where it takes us." The journey begins. The bear moved through the forest with a quiet confidence, its massive frame blending into the shadows. Maggie followed at a cautious distance, clutching Noah tightly. The ground was uneven and slippery, but the bear seemed to sense their struggle. It slowed its pace, glancing back occasionally to ensure they were still following. They walked for what felt like hours, the cold seeping into Maggie's bones. Just as her strength began to wane, the bear stopped. It turned to face her, its gaze calm and steady, and then it stepped aside, revealing a small hollow beneath a rocky overhang, a place of refuge. The space was sheltered from the wind and dry enough to offer some protection from the cold. Maggie's knees buckled as she sank to the ground, clutching Noah to her chest. She looked up at the bear, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said, tears streaming down her face. The bear rumbled softly in response before settling down a few feet away. It curled its massive body into a protective position, its eyes half closed but still watchful. For the first time in hours, Maggie felt a glimmer of hope. This wild, untamed creature had not only saved them, but had also guided them to safety. As exhaustion overtook her, she leaned against the rock, her son nestled in her arms, and allowed herself to believe for just a moment that they might survive the night. The storm had passed, leaving behind a cold, damp stillness that blanketed the forest. Maggie stirred awake, her back pressed against the rocky wall of the hollow. Her arms tightened instinctively around Noah, who was nestled against her chest, his tiny breaths warm against her skin. She blinked, disoriented, until her eyes landed on the bear. It was still there, its massive frame lying a few feet away, its eyes half open but alert. The sight was surreal, yet somehow Maggie no longer felt the same paralyzing fear she had the night before. The morning light brought new clarity and new worries. They were stranded in the wilderness with no food, no water, and no clear path back to safety. Maggie's legs ached, her clothes were soaked, and her hands bore raw cuts from her struggle in the river. But above all, she was terrified of what the next few hours would bring. The hunger sets. In Noah's stomach growled, a small sound that broke the silence. Maggie felt a pang of guilt and helplessness. She hadn't eaten since the previous morning. and she had no idea how to provide for her son in a place like this. "We'll find something," she whispered, stroking his hair. "Just hold on." As if on cue, the bear rose to its feet, shaking its fur and letting out a low grunt. Maggie froze, unsure of what it was about to do. The animal stepped out of the hollow, pausing to glance back at her. It was waiting. "Does it want us to follow?" she wondered aloud, her voice trembling. Noah tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, the bear is helping us. I think it wants to show us something." Maggie's instincts screamed to stay put, but desperation overruled caution. She stood, her legs weak but determined, and carried Noah as she followed the bear deeper into the forest. The search for sustenance. The bear led them to a small clearing where wild berry bushes grew in abundance. Maggie's heart leapt with relief as she recognized the familiar red fruit. She hesitated, glancing at the bear, but it showed no signs of aggression. Instead, it began foraging, pawing at the bushes and eating the berries. Taking this as a sign, Maggie knelt and picked a handful of the berries, inspecting them carefully before offering one to Noah. He hesitated, his small face scrunching up as he looked at the bear, then back at his mother. "It's okay," she said softly. "See, the bear's eating them too." Noah took a tentative bite, his expression brightening as the sweet juice filled his mouth. Maggie ate sparingly, knowing she needed to conserve her strength. The bear, meanwhile, seemed content to let them share the bounty. A sudden threat. The moment of peace didn't last. As they rested by the berry bushes, a low growl rumbled through the air, not from the bear but from somewhere beyond the trees. Maggie stiffened, her heart racing as she scanned the forest. From the shadows emerged a wolf, its golden eyes fixed on them. Then another appeared. And another. "No," Maggie whispered, clutching Noah tightly. The bear let out a thunderous roar, rising to its full height. The wolves hesitated, their growls faltering as they assessed the situation. The bear was a formidable opponent, but hunger made the wolves bold. Maggie backed away slowly, her eyes never leaving the predators. Noah buried his face in her shoulder, his small body trembling. The wolves circled, their movements calculated and predatory. Maggie's breath came in shallow gasps, fear threatening to paralyze her. The bear's defense. Just as one of the wolves lunged, the bear charged. Its roar echoed through the forest, a sound so primal that it sent shivers down Maggie's spine. The bear swiped with its massive paw, striking one of the wolves and sending it yelping into the underbrush. The other wolves retreated, growling and snapping, but they didn't dare get too close. The bear stood its ground, a living fortress between the predators and Maggie. After what felt like an eternity, the wolves slinked away, disappearing into the trees. The bear let out a final roar, as if warning them not to return, before turning back to Maggie and Noah. Maggie's knees buckled and she sank to the ground, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The bear rumbled softly in response, lowering itself back onto all fours. A growing bond. As the hours passed, Maggie began to notice things she hadn't before. The bear wasn't just a wild animal acting on instinct, it was watching over them, protecting them. She felt a strange connection forming, one that defied logic but felt undeniably real. Noah, too, seemed to sense it. He grew less afraid, even reaching out to touch the bear's thick fur when it lay down beside them that evening. Maggie's heart raced as she watched, but the bear didn't react aggressively. It merely glanced at the boy and let out a low, rumbling sound. "Do you think it's a mommy bear?" Noah asked, his voice full of wonder. Maggie hesitated. "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe." The long night. That night, the temperature dropped sharply, and Maggie knew they wouldn't survive without warmth. She huddled close to Noah, trying to shield him from the biting cold. Her teeth chattered, her body trembling as she fought to stay awake. The bear seemed to sense their plight. It moved closer, its massive body radiating warmth. At first, Maggie was too afraid to move, but desperation overruled her fear. Carefully, she shifted closer, cradling Noah against her. The bear let out a low rumble, but didn't move away. Instead, it stretched out, creating a barrier between them and the cold night air. For the first time, Maggie allowed herself to relax, if only a little. Lessons from the wild. In the days that followed, the bear became their guide. It led them to streams where they could drink, to sheltered areas where they could rest, and even helped them find edible plants. Maggie marveled at its intelligence, its uncanny ability to understand their needs, but the forest was unforgiving. Maggie struggled with exhaustion, hunger, and the constant fear of predators. Every step felt like a test of her resilience, and every small victory felt like a miracle. Through it all, the bear remained by their side. A moment of revelation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Maggie sat beside the bear. Noah was asleep in her lap, his small face peaceful for the first time in days. Maggie looked at the bear, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Why are you helping us? What are you?" The bear's dark eyes met hers, and for a moment, Maggie thought she saw something there, something almost human. It rumbled softly, a sound that seemed to carry both comfort and mystery. Maggie didn't have answers, but she didn't need them. All she knew was that this bear had saved her and her son time and time again. It had become their protector, their lifeline, and their unlikely friend. A new threat emerges. The days had begun to blur together. Each one felt like a test of endurance, a constant battle against the elements and the ever-present dangers lurking in the forest. Maggie had grown accustomed to the bear's watchful presence, to the quiet strength it exuded as it led them through the wilderness. They were surviving, and for that Maggie was deeply grateful. But deep down she knew that survival wasn't enough. They had to get out of the forest. They needed to return to civilization before it was too late. That morning, as Maggie gathered what little she had left to continue their journey, a sudden movement in the distance caught her attention. Her pulse quickened. The bear stiffened, its ears pricking up as if it had sensed the same thing. "Mommy?" Noah's small voice broke through the tension. He was clinging to her leg, his eyes wide with worry. "Stay close, sweetheart," Maggie whispered, her voice tight with fear. She held him protectively, her gaze scanning the trees. Then she saw it. A pack of wolves, more than a dozen, emerged from the underbrush, their golden eyes gleaming with hunger. The bear growled low in its throat, its massive body tensing as it moved in front of Maggie and Noah. Maggie's heart raced. She had never seen so many wolves together. They were bigger, bolder, and more coordinated than the ones they had encountered before. This wasn't just a hunt, it was a strategy. The wolves were circling them, cutting off any escape routes. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she backed up, clutching Noah tightly. She knew they were cornered. The bear was strong, but could it take on so many? The wolves were relentless, and Maggie was starting to lose hope. The battle for survival. The first wolf lunged, its teeth bared, but the bear met it head-on with a brutal swipe of its massive paw. The wolf yelped, tumbling to the ground, but it was quickly replaced by two others. The air was thick with snarls, growls, and the sounds of claws scraping against rock. Maggie's eyes were wide with terror as the wolves closed in. She couldn't see how they could possibly survive this. The bear was fighting with everything it had, but there were too many of them. Noah clung to her, sobbing softly. "I'm scared, Mama. I want to go home." Maggie didn't know how to respond. She wanted to tell him everything would be okay, but she wasn't sure herself. She had no way of knowing if they would make it out of this alive. A glimmer of hope. Just as Maggie thought the wolves were going to overwhelm the bear, a sudden roar rang out from behind them. Maggie froze, her heart leaping in her chest. She turned, her eyes wide with disbelief. There, emerging from the trees, was another bear, a massive grizzly, even larger than the one that had protected them all this time. It wasn't just any bear. It was an alpha, and it was charging toward the battle with a fury that took Maggie's breath away. The new bear joined the fray with a ferocity that stunned Maggie. Its powerful jaws snapped at the wolves, tearing through their ranks with unrelenting force. The wolves scattered, their coordinated attack crumbling under the overwhelming strength of the two bears. Maggie could hardly believe what she was seeing. The alpha bear fought alongside their bear, its massive paws slamming into the wolves with a power that seemed almost supernatural. In moments, the pack was in retreat, disappearing back into the forest. The bond solidified. As the dust settled, the two bears stood side by side, panting heavily but victorious. The alpha bear glanced toward Maggie, its eyes briefly meeting hers. There was no aggression in its gaze, only an unspoken understanding. Then, without another word, it turned and disappeared back into the trees, leaving the original bear with Maggie and Noah. Maggie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked down at Noah, who had stopped crying and was staring at the bear in awe. "Did you see that?" he whispered. "That bear. It saved us." Maggie nodded, tears welling in her eyes. The danger was over, but she was left with a profound sense of awe. The bond between her and the bear had transcended anything she could have imagined. This was more than just survival. It was a testament to the strength and loyalty of an animal she had never truly understood before. The bear looked at them once more, its gaze steady and calm. It stepped back, allowing them to move forward. The journey home. Over the next few days, the journey became easier. The bear continued to guide them, moving with a quiet determination that inspired Maggie to keep going. The forest no longer felt like a place of danger, but a home they had learned to survive in. Then one morning, as they crested a ridge, Maggie's heart leapt in her chest. Below them, stretching out as far as she could see, was a road. It wasn't much, just a narrow dirt path, but it was civilization. It was a chance to return to safety. The bear stopped at the edge of the ridge, looking back at Maggie. Its dark eyes were full of a deep, almost knowing expression. It didn't need to say anything. It had fulfilled its role, protecting them, guiding them, and now it was time for them to go. A farewell. Maggie dropped to her knees, her heart aching as she realized what was happening. She held Noah close, his small body against hers. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. The bear didn't move. It simply looked at them for a long moment, then turned and vanished into the trees, its powerful form melting into the wilderness. Maggie watched until it was gone, her heart heavy with gratitude. A new beginning. By the time they reached the road, Maggie and Noah were exhausted but alive. They were picked up by a passing motorist who took them to the nearest town. Maggie could hardly speak for the first few hours, still in disbelief that they had made it. The news spread quickly, and soon the story of the bear that saved a child and his mother made headlines across the country. The images of the bear's fierce protection, its unexpected heroism, captivated everyone. But for Maggie, the true story lay in the bond they had shared, between human and animal, between protector and protected. It was a bond that would last forever, one that couldn't be broken by distance or time. And as she lay in a warm bed that night, Noah asleep beside her, Maggie smiled through her tears. She had found something far more precious than survival. She had found a family of sorts in the heart of the wilderness, the return to safety. The days that followed their escape from the forest felt like a dream to Maggie. It was hard to believe that she and Noah were finally free from the grasp of the wilderness, that they had left behind the towering trees and the constant threat of danger. Life in the small town they were taken to was a strange blend of comfort and disconnection, as if the quiet and safety were somehow foreign to them after their harrowing journey. The warm bed, the steady rhythm of daily life, and the sound of people bustling in the streets, it was all overwhelming, and yet it felt like they were being enveloped in a kind of cocoon, slowly shedding the fears that had clung to them during their time in the wild. Maggie sat by the window, looking out at the sun dipping low over the horizon. The town was peaceful, its streets lined with quiet homes and lush trees, a far cry from the untamed expanse of the forest where they had fought for their lives. She couldn't help but think back to the bear, how it had saved them, how it had kept them safe in the most terrifying of circumstances. For the first time, Maggie allowed herself to grieve the experience. She had been so focused on surviving, on getting Noah to safety, that she hadn't allowed herself to feel everything that had happened, the fear, the loss, the pain. The time with the bear had been a blur of emotions, gratitude, awe, and an overwhelming sense of protection. It had been a relationship unlike any other she had experienced in her life. And now, as she sat in the quiet of the evening, She realized just how profoundly that connection had changed her. Noah's transformation. Noah, too, had changed. Maggie watched as he played in the yard with other children, his laughter a stark contrast to the terror-filled silence of the forest. The nightmares that had plagued him in the beginning were slowly fading, replaced by the lightness of childhood once again. But there was something deeper, something permanent that had shifted within him. Whenever he spoke about the bear, his voice was full of wonder. He would recount stories of how the bear had protected them, how it had saved him from danger. He often described how the bear's eyes had looked at him, not as a threat, but with an understanding he couldn't quite explain. One evening, as Noah sat on the porch gazing at the forest in the distance, Maggie joined him, feeling the weight of everything they had experienced. "You know, Mama," Noah said softly, his voice full of quiet reverence, "I think the bear is still out there, watching over us." Maggie's heart swelled at the thought. "I believe that too, sweetie," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She wrapped an arm around him, holding him close as they both looked out at the forest that had been both a prison and a sanctuary, a legacy of courage. Though Maggie and Noah had returned to a life of normalcy, the lessons they had learned in the wilderness would never leave them. The bond they had formed with the bear had left an indelible mark on their souls. It had taught them the value of trust, the power of resilience, and the importance of unlikely friendships. And as the seasons changed, Maggie found herself visiting the forest again, not as a place of fear, but as a place of gratitude. She would walk along the familiar path, remembering the bear's eyes, its protective presence, and the incredible courage it had shown in the face of danger. One winter afternoon, as the first snow began to fall, Maggie stood at the edge of the forest. She closed her eyes, feeling the cold wind against her face, and imagined the bear out there watching over them just as Noah had said. The bond they had shared felt eternal, even across the distance that now separated them. She felt no sadness in this thought, no longing. Instead, there was a deep sense of peace, a peace that came from knowing that they had been part of something much greater than themselves. The forest, the bear, the journey, it was all a part of a story that had shaped them in ways they couldn't yet fully understand. But one thing was certain: they would never forget the bear, and they would never forget the wild, untamed strength it had shared with them. As Maggie and Noah sat together by the fire that night, their story becoming part of the town's lore, she felt a quiet sense of resolution. The world they had returned to might be filled with noise and routine, but it would always hold the memory of the wild and the bond that had saved them. Noah leaned against her, his small body warm and content. "Do you think the bear will always be with us?" he asked, his eyes wide with hope. Maggie smiled, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, her voice full of certainty. "The bear will always be with us." And in that moment, Maggie knew that the true gift of their journey was not just their survival. It was the transformation they had undergone. The world was filled with so many wonders, so many unseen forces that worked in ways they could never fully comprehend. And sometimes those forces came in the most unexpected forms. As they sat in the warmth of their home, Maggie felt a sense of awe, not just for the bear that had saved them, but for the powerful reminder that even in the darkest of moments, there is light, there is hope, and there is always a bond that can carry us through the hardest of trials.